Hi folks, welcome to data analysis. We're talking about coding our qualitative data, and I like to call it mining the data because we're digging in deep and seeing what surfaces, what we can find. So we're going to review some of these techniques, do a little overview, and then this will support you as you move forward in coding your own data. So before we get into that, I want to talk about the framework for qualitative data, qualitative research, and what the process is so that you can think about this holistically as you're working on your design of studies, but more importantly, your dissertation, where I hope you will integrate qualitative methodology. So when we're thinking about our study, our future study, the first thing I want you to do is really think about the questions you want to ask. So you hear people say things like, find a gap in the literature. So you're reading literature, you're really into this issue or topic, and you say to yourself, everything's been done. Not everything has been done. Has it been done in a context that you may have access to that others did not? So think about qualitative data. It is about the people and the settings. So yours may be unique and could add to the current literature. So I want you to think about that because I think the idea of, find a gap in the literature is very overwhelming for people. So we want to talk through that process. So when you're coming up with that topic, that's why those ponderings are so important. What interests you? What issues are you seeing in the workplace? How do you want to better whatever this system may be that's in place? Ask yourself all of those questions. So first thing, determine what your research questions are. Remember, in qualitative, the who, when, where, how, and why. No yes, nos, right? We don't want a yes, no answer. We want to explore, we want to examine. The next thing we want you to do is determine your methodology. If using qualitative, one of the 5 designs, case study, phenomenology, ethnography, narrative, or grounded theory. Then you're going to write your lit review. For me, this is the worst and best part of being a researcher. So digging deep, mining, yeah, looking at all of that literature related to the topic and what has been done, why is it relevant, and what is currently missing. And that's the gap that we're talking about. There is this unspoken role in research writing for not only dissertations, but also for publications that dictates you use literature that is no older than 5 years old. The caveat to that is, because we want current literature, right? What is being done currently within the last 5 years? One caveat to that is, are there really important historical pieces of the research that you have to talk about to add context to your study? I'll give you an example. I wrote my dissertation on questioning patterns of teachers in a middle school content area classroom, social studies to be exact. You cannot talk about teacher questioning patterns unless you talk about Bloom's taxonomy. Very, very old, but that's where it all started. Where we started to examine the types of questions teachers ask, it started with Bloom's. So I can't start the conversation without providing that historical piece for the reader. Now, how are we collecting the data? You had a few articles to read that discusses this, but just as an overview, we do observations, we do interviews, we can collect survey data, because remember, in a questionnaire, not a survey, but a questionnaire, that's what we call it, you can collect some qualitative data in the form of open-ended questions. Those open-ended questions can be coded just like you code any other qualitative data, such as an interview or an observation. We can conduct focus groups, and of course, we can collect artifacts Those can come in many forms. I've seen researchers code pictures, documents, meeting minutes, curriculum, policies in the workplace. So be open-minded when we're thinking about artifacts, things, documents. I say things, right? Because it may not just be documents. It could be video that support what you're studying. So what is data analysis? At the heart of data analysis is this idea of moving back and forth between small pieces of data, large pieces of data that can be abstract in nature. And I think that for many is the difficult part of analyzing qualitative data. If you use your Saldana book, which is the coding book, you will see many, many ways to code data. The important piece is that you articulate to the reader what process you used to analyze that data. So Saldana talks about, and so does Cresswell, that data analysis is moving between the inductive and deductive reasoning. So deductive being more general to more specific, and inductive being going from the specific to the more general. So when you think of deductive, think of an inverted pyramid. When you think of inductive, think of a pyramid and working your way up. Again, the goal is that thick, rich description of whatever that phenomenon may be. And simply put, we're making meaning from the data. Knowing full well that you are interpreting your data and others may interpret it differently. And that, I think that's an important piece that we have to acknowledge. So, something that they talk about in Cresswell and then Saldana also, and maybe even Leichman may talk about this, is interpreting is decoding the data, and when you label it, you're encoding it. So that's another perspective to think about. So you're exploring it by reading through all the information to get a general sense. You're memoing, so you're keeping notes aside from your codes on the transcript that you may be working on, so that you can document your process, but also bracket your biases that may come up. So that memoing becomes an important part of your process as a researcher. So the 5-step process, and this is a combination of many different methodologists, and I just put it into 5 short steps for you. So you want to prepare and organize your data. What does that mean? Well, you want to make sure you transcribe your interviews. Let's pretend it's interviews. You transcribe your interviews and you put it in a format that you can access easily. For instance, margins if you're doing them on paper. If you're doing it, let's say in Word, you're using track changes. So preparing it to get ready to code it is the first step in getting ready. The second step is to review and explore your data. So every methodologist that you read will say to you, you should read through it once to get the sense of it. So although in the coding exercise for the, because of the interest of time, we didn't give it one read through, you could see how valuable that could be with the transcript that we use in class. Getting an overall sense of what this is about. Then the third step is to begin to create your codes, review those codes, and start to collapse them so that eventually you can get to themes and present those to your reader. Because I want you to think about something. When you read an article or when you read a dissertation, you don't have the raw data in front of you. you are just reading their interpretation. And I have some examples on Blackboard for from an article that I did with a couple of colleagues, Dr. Parker and Dr. Hansen, and I present to you the transcript and how it was coded. But then if you scroll down, I show you the final product, which are the themes. Now, what I don't show you is what happened in between. And what happened in between is messy when you have multiple people involved in the data. So here's one visual of thematic analysis, and that is you take your qualitative data, you create the codes, and then you create the themes. So it looks linear on paper, but there really is a lot of circling back through that data. Last night we talked about the 3 C's, which are codes, categories, concepts, and we were working through that. Here's a visual of that. So you have your, let's say you did 2 interviews and an observation. Those go together. I'm going to code them. I'm going to create categories and eventually present those concepts or themes. I like to use the word themes. Some people like to say concepts. But think about in your head, they're really patterns in the data. So probably a little bit of a repeat here, but data can be a number of things: field notes, observation notes, your transcripts, and any artifacts that you may have. But think about if you're collecting data from those multiple data points, that's how we achieve triangulation, which adds rigor to qualitative research. We don't say validity. We don't say reliability. We say things like trustworthiness. So that adds rigor so that you've checked it multiple times. And yes, indeed, this theme is occurring over X number of transcripts, maybe X number of artifacts, maybe X number of observations. So one of the things that came up when we were coding as a group was, do we code every single word? And the answer is it depends. You can do multiple text. You can do a whole text, paragraphs, things that repeat. You can go line by line. You can look for things that are alike, things that are different. So you have to decide how you're going to code and make sure that that process is consistent across your data points. Then, right, you've collected all your data. Now you're going to create these categories or these themes or these patterns, and make sure that you are keeping documentation of what you did with that data. That won't make it to the final paper, but you have to keep that data for 5 years in case there were ever a question. And in your consent, you'll remember in your informed consent, you said that you were going to keep your data in a password protected folder on your computer for 5 years. So here's just an example of how you can code things that are alike and different. So this was a customer service. We're looking at positives and negatives, and these were some of the codes, right? Timely, nice, helpful. All right, we're going to put that in the bucket of positive. So think of themes as buckets. Oh, okay, now the negative was it didn't fix the issue. Customer service, they're rude. Those are negatives. We're going to put that in the negative bucket. How themes occur is whatever buckets are the most full become your themes. Another visual of coding where there are 3 levels: your initial coding, which we call open coding, your focused coding, and then your axial or thematic coding. That is very common in grounded theory. That is a prominent coding methodology, data analysis methodology in grounded theory. Now, I wanted to share this with you. This is an actual table from a dissertation. and you're actually going to meet the author of this dissertation this semester. But this adds trustworthiness and rigor to the study because he tells you the number of codes. He had sub-themes. He had themes and he had sub-themes. He had these 3 overarching themes, and then he had sub-themes that he broke down under each of those themes. So you can see that he conducted 12 interviews. After those 12 interviews, which was 187 pages of transcription, he ended up with 964 different codes that he had to collapse into those 3 themes, and he chose 3 themes. I didn't tell him to choose 3, and then his sub-themes. When you look at these numbers, and he kept his bracketing journals, his memoing, when you look at the amount of data, 517 minutes of interview time, 964 codes, 187 pages of transcription. The moral of the story here is qualitative data is time consuming, it's difficult, but folks, it's rewarding. Here we see another visual that you may find helpful, where the researcher has many pages of text on the left. They read through the data, they start to chunk the data. They got it down to 340 codes. Now they reduce that even more. Again, so recoding, coding and recoding. That's the name of the game. They got down to 5 or 7 themes. That is your goal across your data. Notice here we have another process or method for data analysis. So if you notice at the bottom, we have data collection. Then we do initial coding. And that initial coding comes from your field notes. You have to make sure you're memoing. You're assigning either single words or short phrases. And that, I said to you before, those code names can come from many places. Either you have made it up or it can come directly from the data itself. That's called an in vivo code. So we do our initial coding. Then we can do intercoder agreement or coding by independent coders or researchers. I put an X through this because you will not be doing that for your dissertation. You code your own data. Then we get into focused coding, where we really start to refine and look at what are the repetition, like what is the repetition within this data, and we can start to begin to create larger categories and then eventually concepts or themes. This is called the constant comparative method. So you're going back and forth. I like to compare this to the writing process. That's not a linear process. We don't, okay, I'm going to do my pre-writing, I'm going to brainstorm, then I'm going to do my first draft, then I'm going to do my second draft, I'm going to have somebody look at it. Well, that is a process that you move back and forth between, and many times, multiple times, before you come up with a final draft for publication. That is the same sort of process here. So then people often ask, how do I name my themes? Well, it depends. Fine researcher. It can come from you. It could come from something that the participant said, or it could come from the literature review that you've done to support this study. Typically, and I'm going to speak for myself, I typically create my own themes so that it kind of summarizes or paraphrases what I've learned through those codes. And I like short phrases. That is not a rule. That is just something that I like to do when I publish, and I encourage my students to do. If you think back to the table from my doctoral student who had all of those pages of transcript and all of those codes, he talks about the number of pages he had for memoing. So This has been going on for decades and decades in qualitative research, this idea of memoing, because it allows the researcher to bracket their biases. So that memo, whether it's a notebook, whether it's a document on your computer, is something that you keep separate from your data. So that's important, that that is kept separate and does not make it into your data. It's a place, it's like a journal. It's a place for you to work through some things. And that is what it's used for. So let's take a moment. You have conceptualized your study. You've written your research questions. You've done your literature review. You've found the gap in the literature. Then you went to IRB with the idea, with your consents and your instruments. Your instruments being your interview protocol, your observation protocol, your what artifacts you may be collecting, let's say, in a purely qualitative study. Then you've analyzed your data. Here are the findings. One of the things you have to do in qualitative, like you would do in quantitative, is you have to validate the accuracy of your findings. There are methods that you can use to do that. And next week, you're going to be taking a look at rigor. So you will look at these in more detail. But here are a couple bullet points. Prolonged engagement in the field is an important part of rigor and validating your study, adding trustworthiness to the data. Being very clear to the reader how long you spent in the field, if applicable. I did 8 observations. Each one was an hour. And keep in mind, that means you had 8 observation protocols with all of your field notes, all of your observation notes. That is going to be an important piece for the reader. So you weren't just there once. You did it multiple times in this study. Triangulation that we have been mentioning. So gathering data from multiple data points, like having multiple data points, adds rigor and trustworthiness to the study. Peer review. So I asked you to create an interview protocol and an observation protocol. You want others looking at it and asking the questions. So often we will pilot your instruments, and then after the piloting, you will ask the participants, now can you give me feedback with this? Often with doctoral students, I will say, did you have 3 professionals in your field look at your questions and give you feedback? All valuable peer review. 4th bullet, bracketing your biases, making sure that you're very clear on what those are. Member checking. Member checking is when you go back to the participants and you ask them for clarification. This is what I thought you meant. Do you agree or disagree? Well, I disagree. What did you mean? So going back to them and asking for clarification and making sure, in essence, they're giving you the check mark, right? Yes, this is exactly what I meant. Go forward. Rich, thick description will always be my favorite phrase, and there it is. And then doing, having an external audit, having somebody that is not involved in the study looking at that and asking you the hard questions. What is also not on there that's important that I talk about in another video is an audit trail. So making sure every document that you have is kept somewhere so that anybody could go back and look at your data and see, check how you came up with those findings. This is probably a great slide since I just talked about the audit trail. So from a quantitative perspective, reliability is a really important part, right? Validity, reliability. Reliability refers to the extent to which the research findings can be replicated. So often my students in qualitative will say, well, I want to replicate that study. You cannot replicate that study. Even if you use the same setting, with the same participants, with all the same instruments, the researcher is part of the data analysis process, so it could never be the same. So we talk about dependability, which is kind of the qualitative brother, twin brother of reliability. And that is that if given this data that you've collected qualitatively, the results would make sense to an outsider. So that's why I said in the previous slide that audit trail is so important. And this is the final slide, which leads us into the next week when we talk about rigor. And this is the type of triangulation that we can use in qualitative research. So on the left quadrant, upper left quadrant, we talk about data triangulation. So collecting the same data from multiple points. Underneath that, which you cannot do in your dissertation, but you will do once you graduate and become a researcher in your field, having multiple investigators or researchers involved. I had talked about intercoder agreement, having multiple coders. That's where that triangulation occurs when you're talking about investigator triangulation. In the upper right quadrant, triangulation, which this is typically what most people think of when they think of triangulation, and that is collecting it in a mixed methods sort of way where you have quantitative data and qualitative data that agree with each other. And then finally, you can also triangulate with the literature. You can have theories that help support your findings. So when you think about triangulation, don't just think about the upper right quadrant. There are other ways to triangulate your data. So a lot of information. I hope this was helpful as you move forward and collect your own interview data and then observation data. Thank you.